ce știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de-i plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. самых окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Жить там, страна моя родная, слава ей, полполей ей. Я другой такой страны не знаю, но я такой навижу человек. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой навижу человек. За столом никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Страна, страна моя родная, слава ей, полполей ей. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой навижу человек. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой навижу человек. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Страна моя родная, слава ей, полполей ей. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой навижу человек. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой навижу человек.
что рабочий ты сам. И так как все мы люди, то должны мы извинить, и что-то есть. Хотят накормить нас пустой болтовней, чертям спасибо за честь. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, взять ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как ты рабочий, то не жди, что нам поможет другой. Себе мы свободу добудем твою своей рабочей рукой. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, встать ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Modern in the cities, ready all in der Arbeiter Einheitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Ready ein in der Arbeiter Einheitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Pod słońcem rasti jasna dzieci, rasti i cvietaj zemljoradnih ljudi i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napučini i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti miền biển xa, người đi khắp phương trời. Ở nơi xa đó, người dân đói nghèo, từ đau thương người đi khắp năm châu lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng soi, dõi chiếu sáng dân mình. Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh. Vượt trùng sông, người đi khắp phương trời, luyện tôi ý chí lòng núi căm hờn. Hồ Chí Minh, người đi khắp năm châu lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng soi, dọi chiếu sáng dân mình. Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh. Miền biển xa, người đi khắp phương trời. Ở nơi xa đó, người dân đói nghèo, từ đau thương người đi khắp năm châu lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng soi, dọi chiếu sáng dân mình. Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh. Vượt trùng sông, người đi khắp phương trời, luyện tôi ý chí lòng núi căm hờn. Hồ Chí Minh, người đi khắp năm châu lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng soi, dọi chiếu sáng dân mình. Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh. Miền miền Đông, sao tắt nơi chân trời. Ở nơi xa đó, người dân đói nghèo, từ đau thương người đi khắp năm châu lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng soi, dọi chiếu sáng dân mình. Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh.
Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ
Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 31st of July, 2025, and we come to you tonight with a live stream, as the title might indicate, looking at the reports about the potential for a coup against Zelensky, along with a few other things as well. So be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. It is around about 7:15, Perfidious Albion time. So I'm going to be looking at that tonight. The coups and war rumors of coups against our old friend, the cocaine clown of Kiev. So stand by for that in just a moment. And be sure to, as I said, like and share the stream. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, the Twitch channel, our channel on Twitter or X, and on Rumble. So let's see who we've got with us tonight in terms of the chat thus far. So we've got Working Pro Incorporated, Mystery Man, Sophia from Tennessee, James Graham, Luigi, maybe not that one, Lucas from Washington State, Alan Chavez from the former capital of the slave-owning South, Richmond, Virginia. We've got David King. We have Mo 1917 tuning in from work, whatever work happens to be. We have DJ Darkside with us, who is here. I think is that a football club logo on your profile picture there? I can't quite see. Good evening to Jerry and to Why I Ain't Cool 46 and to Victor and Potted Rodent and Chandler and Will Johnson and Walter Stolzing, Nemo Yederman, Caustic Grip, T.G. Wilson, Lumina Cadence. There was an argument in the chat about who is going to play Zelensky in the biopic. I always thought it was going to be Ben Stiller ultimately, and DJ Darkside confirms that the football club that is in the profile pic there is Burnley FC. Last won the top division in the English Football League in 1959 to 1960, which is still closer to our current time than the last time my club won the top division title, which is all the way back in 1930. So we've also got Callum, and we have Jonas Levinson, we have Comrade Jawad, we have Ben over there in southwestern Hungary, we have Davey and Molotov Cocktail. And Devolcious G. There we go. We've got also President Jesus and Irish Partisan and Dan Lindstrom and Paul McCord and President Jesus. Have I seen Andor season 2 yet? Not yet, but it is on my list. Right. So, Tommy Douglas Hare, good evening to you as well. Okay, so future attractions. Tomorrow we're going to be looking at, or should we say, dissecting the horrendous interview given by Saint Jeremy of Islington to the ever so twitchy gentleman known as Owen Jones, who appears to be on, let's just say, an awful lot of caffeine recently. So we're going to be looking at that tomorrow and looking at this. But we will get into tonight the question of the coup in Kiev and also why it is that Keir Starmer, Macron, Friedrich Merz, and other assorted imperialist politicians are now proclaiming themselves to be all in favor of a Palestinian state. So, cough is nearly gone, by the way. Thank you to those who are asking. Excuse me. So, President Jesus says Simon Pegg would probably play Zelensky. It would be his dream role. Well, I often thought that if when it comes to making a movie of Zelensky and Zelensky's presidency, it would be if one was going to make a film that would be interesting and not just an attempt at a hagiography, which was what would have been done earlier on in the war, then the interesting thing to do would be to have it shot almost like the old George Clooney film when he used to make some interesting things, called Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, which was, of course, an early role for Sam Rockwell, and featured the host of the Gong Show, the old American thing, the Gong Show, which who used to claim that he was a secret agent alongside being a host of like some sort of American trash TV thing, and the juxtaposition of the scenes where he was like in doing his secret agent stuff, or which was, as it turns out, well, arguably a fantasy, and the real life, and his real life was quite interesting. And the guy's name, the lead character, was based on a guy called Chuck Barris, who, again, played by Sam Rockwell. So I thought it'd be interesting to, if you were going to do a film about Zelensky's life, given that he played the president of Ukraine on TV, and famously did the old trick with his member and the piano, to actually have that, to actually riff on that, and have the fantasy version of Zelensky be, what the film starts off with. So you start off with the fantasy version of Zelensky, the hero, the square-jawed, bold leader of Ukrainian freedom, the Ukrainian freedom struggle, the fantasy version of Zelensky that has been written and put in the newspapers and on TV by his handlers, who are mostly from MI6 and the British Foreign Office, it would seem. And so you have the fantasy version start the film, and then as the film goes on, the real version of Zelensky starts to become more and more pronounced. This coke-addled, twitchy, treacherous, cowardly lunatic who has literally sold the Ukrainian nation for pennies on the dollar to US and British imperialism, and has done so at the cost of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives. So the interesting thing would be to film that in such a way as like the horrible, corrupt, rotten reality of who he actually is starts to intrude more and more as the film goes on, until in the end you're faced with the reality, which is like rather than the bold hero, you have like a guy like hoovering up vast lines of the old phrases Colombian marching powder, and at the same time condemning hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men to death. And that would be the ultimate conclusion of the film, that this is the reality, and the fantasy version slowly falls away through the film, and you're left with, I don't know, Ben Stiller or Simon Pegg or whoever it is, hoovering up a vast line of cocaine, surrounded by like these like blood-drenched fascist guys and like British sort of tightly wound British special forces guys who are guarding him as he loads up on cocaine and sends hundreds of thousands of more to die. And that would be the end point. The grim reality finally catches up, and then the film basically ends with him being brought face to face with all of his victims. Maybe that's the kind of film that would only get made these days in Russia. So maybe I should submit my speculative script to a Russian film studio. I'm sure there's plenty of guys in Russia who look a bit like Zelensky, so they could probably find loads of actors who could play him. But to go back to the point about Zelensky and trying to desperately keep the show on the road. So let's go now to what I'm talking about here, which is a recent Substack piece by Seymour Hersh, who spelt out in this piece why his sources think that his days are numbered, and what Hersh claims in this piece, which is just from 13 days ago, just a couple of weeks ago now, that Valery Zelensky, the former Ukrainian Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief, currently very well remunerated supposed ambassador to Britain, is being lined up to replace Zelensky. And Hersh cites unnamed sources in the US intelligence community that who state that Trump has had enough of him, and that these various different forces inside Ukraine are coming together to carry off a coup against him. Now, the more you go into this, the less likely all of this seems. Now, I went into this a little bit just the other day on the last stream, where I was talking about the fact that in a country like Ukraine, or back in the day, the fascist Germany, Hitlerite Germany, when faced with a disastrous and apocalyptic defeat, which is what Zelensky is faced with, or faced with the fact that, like, he doesn't have the capacity to negotiate any kind of peace deal because he no longer has the ability, if he ever did, to command the loyalty of significant parts of the Ukrainian armed forces if he stops the war. Like, the only thing keeping him in place is his ability to deliver upon the priorities of the British and the American imperialists. And also the only thing that keeps at bay the various different fascist militias that are probably the real power in Kiev and Lvov is the continuation of the war. If the war stops, Zelensky's rule stops. More to the point, if the war stops in an unfavorable situation, which it would, then Zelensky's rule ends. And not only that, but Zelensky's life ends. So the only thing that's going to keep him in one piece is the continuation of the war, because if he continues the war and continues to serve the purposes of his British handlers, and he is in particular a British puppet, as is Zelensky, then he can hope to, as can his inner circle, including people like Andrei Yermak, Ponomarenko, people like that, then he can hope to get out and have his exit facilitated by his masters. If he goes rogue, if he signs a peace deal with the Kremlin, with the Russian government, then he's finished. Then not only would his handlers not want that, especially the British, but I would argue also the United States, and for all Trump's noises to the contrary, then if he signs a deal which gives away too much, which ends the war, then he will have no more use value for them. Now, what makes me disbelieve that there is a credible successor to him is that as soon as the central authority is seen to change or to wobble, then there's a fair chance that large sections of the Ukrainian armed forces on the front line will start to wobble and desert, more so than they are already. Not only that, but how much loyalty does Zelensky command? The only way that the British in particular, but also the US imperialists, will be interested in bringing in Zelensky would be to continue the war. It wouldn't be to make peace. And as I have re-emphasized over and over again, the only peace that the US and the British are interested in is one that enables them to preserve the Kiev regime. If they can preserve the Kiev regime without Zelensky, if they thought that by bringing in Zelensky, they could secure a favorable peace, and the favorable peace, remember, is for them one that preserves the Kiev regime, which gives minimal territorial concessions to Russia, which keeps Ukraine viable by keeping Odessa in Ukrainian hands, which refuses the Russian demands over disarmament of the Ukrainian armed forces, which manages to keep open the possibility of continuing to flood Ukraine with weaponry and also foreign troops. And that would be the Kellogg plan, basically. So the only way they're going to bring in Zelensky is if it does one of two things: keeps the war going in a more effective way than Zelensky can, and also or brings about that kind of peace settlement with the Russians. And in the article by Hirsch, Hirsch claims that Zelensky has a certain degree of credibility with the Russians because he's on speaking terms with Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff. But it's not Gerasimov who gets to make these decisions. It is, of course, the Russian government as a whole as to who they're going to negotiate with. Now, Hirsch also mentions in this article that, and this is where I start to really feel that this is just a simple piece of propaganda and misinformation, which Hirsch's sources in US intelligence are using him to put out there. Because in the article, and I would urge everybody to go and read it for themselves, Hirsch claims that the Russian casualties in the Ukraine war are topping out at 2 million. 2 million killed and wounded. Now, that is an absolutely unbelievable number. And it's an unbelievable number, excuse me, because, and here I'm going to just change screen shares here, even Media Zona, which, as it says on its front page, is a collaboration with BBC News Russian service and a media operation that is funded by the exiled treacherous oligarch who was previously put on trial in Russia for tax evasion, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And even they claim that up to now, the total recorded dead in terms of Russian forces is 119,154, and their probable estimate is 165,000 dead. So this is an absolutely extraordinary claim from Hirsch that the total number of Russian casualties is 2 million. He also repeats without criticism a claim by a US intelligence source that the Putin planned a massive summer offensive and it's all gone wrong, and that's why Putin needs a deal, and that's why but he won't deal with Zelensky, and Trump wants a deal, so they'll bring in Zelensky, and Zelensky will do a deal with the Russians. This is a nonsense. There hasn't been a gigantic Russian offensive. There have been a number of smaller scale offensives in the war thus far this spring and summer. But this idea of like a giant sweeping offensive going forward to try and end the war once and for all, this just hasn't happened. What the Russians have been doing is these relatively small to medium scale offensives along the front line, which have focused, as has been the strategy since late 2023, after the Russians carried out their partial mobilization and significantly expanded their forces. What has happened is they have focused on slowly pushing the Ukrainian forces backward, and they have focused not on taking vast amounts of territory, but in annihilating the Ukrainian forces. So Hirsch is claiming that Russian casualties are around about 2 million. I would say, I mean, it's his claim, but he's articulating a claim that is actually made by figures who he gets his information from in the US intelligence services. See, what Hirsch is doing is he's basically lending his name and credibility to various different actors within the US security states who want to put a narrative out there. That's what he's doing. There's an argument to say that that's what he's always done. That in return for like the occasional, like genuinely impressive scoop I mean, remember, this is the man who broke the story of the My Lai massacre over 50 years ago, who broke the story of the US torture program in Iraq. So in return for getting these huge, genuinely huge stories, he often lends his name to reports that are given to him by various sources inside the US intelligence apparatus that they want his name on to give some credibility. So it's clear that this report about Zelensky and Zelensky and the apparent maneuvering going on to get rid of Zelensky is much less about Zelensky and Zelensky, because as I've already said, I don't believe that this this scenario that Hirsch actually paints here, that they're readying Zelensky to come in and Zelensky's going to sign a deal, I don't find that to be credible in the slightest. I don't find it credible because Zelensky's political base, if he has one, is equally dependent upon the fascistic elements in the Ukrainian armed forces. In fact, perhaps more so than even Zelensky himself. Now, it may well be that some of these guys, some of these like Azov guys and others, are looking at the front line and thinking, we're fucked. If we carry on much longer, there's going to be nothing left. Maybe some of those people are thinking that. But again, the only deal that will be available to them, that will be permissible for their foreign backers, will be one that seeks to preserve the Maidan regime as it is and preserve foreign influence inside the bulk of Ukraine. That is a deal which ultimately is unacceptable to the Russians, because it would leave the Ukrainian regime as it stands in place, and it would leave the influence of NATO inside Ukraine in place, even if there was no formal agreement about joining NATO, and even if that was ruled out for 20 years, it will be absorbed into NATO if the agreement that the US wants is ultimately pushed forward. So it would be something that would be unacceptable to the Russian government, hence why the Russian government's position hasn't changed. They haven't actually started like a major offensive. I mean, they have a fairly limited amount of time before the rainy season returns. So I wonder whether there's even going to be one, because that hasn't been the style that they've gone with so far, or whether they are going to continue the war at the current level to the point where they bring the Ukrainian regime to the point of utter collapse due to the massive losses of manpower. And then once things have been brought to the point of no return, then you'll see some kind of like bold advance. So it might not even be for the rest of this year, depending upon the status of the front line. It may be we're looking at spring next year before the Russians can close this out. Because again, to go back to the old adage from Clausewitz about war being a continuation of policy by other means. Clausewitz, of course, had a very properly dialectical understanding of the question, which is that wars are, often portrayed to the layman population as being something which is almost disconnected to the rest of the policies of states and ruling classes. But the way in which this war has been fought is very much in line with the way that each side actually has, with regard to each side's relative strengths and weaknesses. And the way in which the British and the Americans have fought the war, but the British in particular, as I have argued before, very much is about outsourcing. It's very much about the British and the Americans, with also the French and the Germans in the mix as well, running an outsourced Ukrainian army as in similar ways to the way in which the old East India Company used to run its outsourced local armies, which is you had British officers working for the company, commanding Indian soldiers. And in this case, it's British officers, American officers, French officers training and arming, and in some cases, I think, commanding remotely, and in some cases, commanding on the front line Ukraine, the bodies in this case, which is the bodies on the line are the Ukrainians. But it's a vast outsourced operation where the manpower is outsourced, where the weaponry is often produced inside the United States, but a lot of that production of that is outsourced too. Where what the US and the British provide is the expertise, technology to a certain degree, intelligence, reconnaissance, and organizational management side of things. And the grunt work is done by the Ukrainians. And that is pretty much perfectly summarizes like the British way of war now, which is that the British seek to amplify their power. The British imperialists seek to amplify their power by taking over another state and turning it into something which is run by them. Even though at most levels you will see a Ukrainian in charge, behind them lie British officers, American officers, to a lesser extent, French and German officers. And in the civilian government, it's nominally Ukrainians, but behind them sit British and American advisors. Look elsewhere for this model of imperialism, and you'll see that this is something the British specialize in. And we're going to be doing more about this as we trace what the actual power of British imperialism is these days. And the actual power of British imperialism lies not in direct occupations, but in insidious penetration and infiltration and takeovers. And this is true of Ukraine. It's also true of a place like Azerbaijan, when we're going to be doing more on that next week, where over 30 years, the British in particular have infiltrated and have essentially puppeted the Azerbaijani state due to the long-term relationship between the Azerbaijani state and British Petroleum, and beyond the British Petroleum, the British intelligence services, though BP and MI6 are basically indistinguishable at many different points in the world. But this is the model, and they're not going to give that up very easily. So go over to the Russian side, and what does the way in which this war has fought tell us about the relationship between the Russian armed forces and the Russian state as led by President Putin? What you see is that at each stage, up until relatively recently, the Russian armed forces tactics have been based around the idea that they are looking to get themselves a favorable negotiating position. And because that is the essence of the Putin system, is it is a cautious government of Russian national liberals being the dominant group, Russian national bourgeois, which as time has gone on, like the initial big bang from the advance was meant to overwhelm the Maidan regime and force it to sign an agreement. And this was still the position until relatively recently, even with the mobilizations, even with the vast expansion of Russian war material production, dependent upon, of course, the old industrial base bequeathed to the Russian Federation by the former Soviet Union. Even with all of that, what was happening was a sort of bigger and more advanced version of the same tactics, which is that the overall strategy for dealing with Ukraine is to make sure that Russia keeps NATO out of Ukraine one way or another, but that this is done via an agreement. And it wasn't until really towards this time last year or slightly later that you started to see the point of view within the Russian government that stated that there couldn't be a negotiated outcome start to gain real credibility in terms of winning over the majority, being the majority position there. And I'd argue it's only now when it becomes absolutely clear that not only is Trump not going to pull out, not going to pull American support, he's just going to juggle it and make it look as if the Europeans are taking this over. But the war will continue with just the Americans telling the Europeans to supply the weaponry and that they'll buy it from the United States. And yes, there's been recently some sort of haggling with Zelensky. Trump himself, if Trump wants anything, probably does want some kind of deal, but Trump has no idea how to get such a deal and has no idea what one would look like. And most of the people he employs either have no idea what they're doing or are just going along with a script given to them by the Washington establishment, by the U.S. imperialist brains trust. So what we'll end up with is the war continuing. And to go back to the point about war being continuation of policy by other means, so the policy of the Russian government has slowly and gradually evolved from one where they sought really minimal territorial acquisitions. Excuse me a moment. To one where they are forced to reckon with the fact that they now need to have a policy which involves essentially the annexation of at least Novorossiya and to cut Ukraine off from the sea and to make whatever Ukrainian state is left to be one that would be wholly aligned with Moscow. And the only, as I said before, the only real disagreement left is, well, what exactly do they do with the west of Ukraine? So that has become the position, though, has taken 3 years of war. It's taken 3 years of war to move the consensus in the Russian government and the wider Russian ruling circles away from a point where what they were after was a deal and a if not a reconciliation, then something of a rapprochement with the West. It's what the Russian national bourgeois wanted when Trump got in. This is where the delusions within the Russian government ultimately stem from. The Russian national bourgeois want a reintegration to a degree, at least with Europe, to get back the energy markets that they lost in 2022. They even hoped for a reconciliation with US imperialism itself, which is what they've always wanted. Bear in mind, go back and look at the speech that Putin gave in 2007 to the Munich Security Conference. It wasn't getting up there and slamming the hammer down on the table and saying, like the old gag from The Simpsons, the USSR's back. Didn't you guys go out of business? Haha, that's what we wanted you to think. It's not that. It's a speech of the Russian national bourgeoisie saying, we will deal with you on a state-to-state basis, on the basis of a partnership of equals. We will trade with you. You can have investments in our country, but you can't run our country. We do that. And the US and the British threw a shit fit and have never accepted that and still don't accept that, which is what's made any deal impossible. But the Russian national bourgeois are the most deluded people in the world sometimes because they keep looking at the personnel changes, even though Putin himself has said on numerous occasions that presidents change, but the policy doesn't. But the Russian ruling class, even the national bourgeois, still were desperate to bring this war to an end and get a negotiated settlement. What's making that impossible is not the belligerence of the Russian side. It's the belligerence of the American and the British side. The British in particular are desperate for this war to continue, but the feelings and, shall we say, the needs of the American bourgeoisie aren't actually that much different. They need to subordinate and essentially conquer Russia via a color revolution or a palace coup and the restoration of Yeltsinism. They need that almost as badly as the British do. I don't really buy this argument that the US doesn't require a subordinated Russia. They do. They've realized they can't get one in the way in which that they actually thought they were going to get one, but they still require it. They require a destroyed and subordinated China too. They require a destroyed and subordinated Iran. Now, the dispute in the United States is not over whether they want this or not, or whether they want to see Putin-led system overcome and Russia reintegrated as a neo-colony of the West, that's not in argument between the different factions in the United States and in Britain. That's not what's at issue. What's at issue is how they get it. They've realized they can't get it via just continual assault, but what they want to do is to pause things and come back and try again later. And so they would like the Russians to agree to that. And the Russians can't and won't agree to it. So this leads us back to the question of the fate of Zelensky and Zelensky. What Hershey's article is not the reality, but the wishful thinking of those who are aligned with Trump inside the American intelligence apparatus, those who want to see an agreement but can't get one because they can't actually have the agreement that they would want because the Russians won't agree to it, can't agree to it. So there will be, I will stick my neck out, and if I'm wrong, I'll come back and analyze why I'm wrong. If things go the way they are, there will be no removal of Zelensky. There will be all kinds of plots against him. There will be all kinds of names mentioned. There will be all kinds of alternatives put out there. And none of it will happen. What will happen is, because none of the groups inside Kiev can marshal the necessary popular will behind them to deliver the kind of agreement that would be able to be sold to either the Ukrainian fascist types or their masters in London and Washington. Nobody has the power or the authority to do that. So what will happen is they'll end up sticking with Zelensky. Zelensky will be there, I think, until the bitter fucking end, when eventually the Russians are forced to do something drastic, like take Kiev, which is what in the end it will take to bring this to a close. They will have to take Kiev, even if they ultimately don't wish to run it themselves, even if they reconstitute another version of a Ukrainian state inside central Ukraine. In the end, they'll have to take it. They'll have to destroy the Maidan government. They'll have to force its capitulation. And that's ultimately a game that the British and the Americans are fully aware of, and one that ultimately that they'll play, because the British ruling class will then, as I've said many times before, will then adopt their preferred policy, which is arming and funding terrorists inside Ukraine to target Russians and Russian interests. Now, what will become of Zelensky? He will be there till the bitter end, and if he serves his masters well, they'll pull him out. But there will be no coup against him, and Zelensky will not be able to actually deliver anything more than Zelensky can. So, moving on then to the next part of our agenda, which is the question of occupied Palestine, and the question of why Keir Starmer and co. Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Friedrich Merz, also I believe the Polish reactionaries have said they're in favor of a Palestinian state. Though interestingly enough, it was the old government of People's Republic era Poland who set that policy in 1988, and the modern Polish state that succeeded People's Republic of Poland have never reversed that policy. But so you got Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, Keir Starmer of Britain, and Macron of France, Merz of Germany, and countless others all saying that they will recognize a Palestinian state unless the Israeli government stops its assault on Gaza. And that this will be done in September at I believe, the meeting of the UN General Assembly. So that's the reasoning behind this. And so the question is, why have they done this? Now, Starmer has been all over the map on this question. He has he took like an ultra pro Zionist position for a very long time. In fact, that was the basis for his leadership, was that he was going to make up for that terrible Jeremy Corbyn, that wild opponent of Zionism, even though Corbyn himself is a Zionist buffoon. And so Starmer, fairly early on, after October the 7th, went on the record as backing the right of the Israeli regime to cut off food and water to Gaza. And we can go and check, if you like. If you don't believe me, go and check Starmer's interview from, I believe it was November 2023, where he was talking about the right of the Israelis to do that, which is exactly what they've done. And there's no doubt that is genocidal in its intentions. And that is exactly why, of course, Starmer proclaimed himself to be in favour of it. So just pausing for a second, say thanks to all 366 of you watching. Be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already. So we are proceeding onwards with the section of the programme on occupied Palestine. So why the change of position? Now, there's several reasons why this is. Partly, it's because the very stability of the Israeli regime itself is now coming into question. They have been unable, over now almost 2 years of constant grinding warfare with periodic ceasefire breaks, to uproot and destroy the Palestinian resistance movements inside Gaza itself. They've been unable to do that. The fighting capacity of the resistance remains intact, even though I'm sure it's been damaged, but their ability to inflict casualties upon the Israeli forces remains intact. The Israeli forces themselves have been damaged by the long war in Gaza. There's record numbers now, again, according to reports in the Israeli press, and I will dive more into this in a future episode. There's record numbers of desertions, record numbers of former and serving Israeli personnel being treated for shell shock and various other psychological conditions related to long-term service in Gaza. There is increasing discontent within the military hierarchy itself over the government's inability to end the war. The Israelis haven't been able to resolve the northern theater either. They haven't been able to uproot and destroy Hezbollah. That's why they were relying upon the US doing the dirty work for them via some kind of shady deal with the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah. Hezbollah won't accept that. As soon as Hezbollah is disarmed, what fragile sovereignty Lebanon has would be destroyed, if not by the Israelis themselves, then maybe by the roving bands of Al-Qaeda men coming out of Syria. The Al-Qaeda government of Syria, of course, which is sponsored by Britain and the United States and Israel, and of course Turkey, President Erdogan being a key player in all of this as well. But the Israelis can't uproot Hezbollah, despite the fact they inflicted damage upon Hezbollah by killing large numbers of its leadership, including Hassan Nasrallah himself. They've been unable to uproot them. They can't resolve the situation in the Red Sea, and they are faced with significant internal problems as a result of all of this. That and the reason why you're also seeing people like Ehud Olmert, who used to be many years ago in the same party as Benjamin Netanyahu, used to be in the days of that old fat slug Ariel Sharon. Ehud Olmert was in Likud along with Sharon, and of course many others who went off after Sharon's plan to withdraw from Gaza, which was ordered, incidentally. Sharon was ordered to pull out of Gaza by the Bush administration, by George W. Bush. And that meant that Sharon, thanks to opposition inside the Likud party led by Netanyahu, had to leave Likud and form the Kadima party, if you remember that one, which was when Sharon dropped dead or went into a coma. Ehud Olmert took over and, of course, led the disastrous war against Hezbollah in 2006, which the Israelis lost. But Olmert and others have been going on the record for quite some time now and saying that Netanyahu must go, that the war is a disaster, that they are essentially pouring petrol on their own funeral pyre. Now, is this because Ehud Olmert has become convinced of the need for negotiations and regrets his past? Probably not. But he is representative of a trend in the upper circles of the Israeli regime, which has decided that the longer this goes on, in actual fact, the more damaged and destabilized the Israeli state becomes, and the more likely it is to ultimately plunge into a devastating collapse in the long run, or even in the medium term. And so Olmert and others are now coming out and saying that there must be some kind of sanction against the Israeli government, that Netanyahu must be forced out, that the war must be brought to a close. Not because they are particular converts to the idea of Palestinian statehood, but because they can see the damage that's being done to the Israeli regime. And also that if it gets to the point where the imperialist powers, except the United States under Trump, carry out this largely symbolic recognition of a Palestinian state, then that will further damage the Tel Aviv regime, because Netanyahu and co will completely reject it. As one of the Knesset members who addressed some international meeting earlier this week says, if you want a Palestinian state, you can have it in London and Paris, meaning absolutely no way, we're not doing it. But what of course, the Starmer and Macron and Carney and Merz have in mind is not a Palestinian state that would be even on the basis of the old Oslo Accords, but basically a truncated puppet state in the West Bank and maybe some of Gaza that would be completely controlled by the US and Israel, and also that would be ruled over by, again, a puppet regime headed by someone like Mahmoud Abbas. And that would be what the British, the Canadians, etc., would recognize, believing that that would then resolve the situation for them. And for the Western Europeans, the British and the Canadians, this is also becoming a increasingly severe internal problem for them. It's an internal problem for them because of there's a growing revolt against their policies, and also growing revulsion against them that's brought the questions of legitimacy to the fore, particularly, I would say, in Britain and in Germany, where there is, again, like, due to the revulsion of against the actions of the governments there in backing the genocide, and the fact that the governments in London and Berlin, in particular, are prepared to use state repression to ban parties or organizations like Palestine Action and others in this country, which have carried out militant actions in support of the Palestinian struggle. The state's banned them, or is trying to ban them, and arrest people for belonging to them or staging protests in solidarity with them. That's having a very damaging impact in this country upon the tattered legitimacy of the Labour Party. And it's having the similar impact in Canada and France and Germany as well. So for the reasons of their desperate need to try and preserve the Israeli regime itself, ideally, they would want the Israeli regime to be preserved, but without Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, etc., being at the top of it. Ideally, they would want some sort of puppet state in the West Bank alongside the Israeli regime, which could then be stabilized, and they would get rid of the most obnoxious elements within it that are openly tied to the genocide. And somehow, in the fantasies of Starmer and Merz and Macron and Carney, they would find some sort of political leadership in Israel that's not up to its neck in blood. And this would stabilize the situation. It would preserve the Israeli regime. It would give the British, the French, the Germans, the Canadians a puppet regime in the West Bank, which they would run. Remember, as our comrade and friend Kit Clarenberg has said on past episodes of the Decline and Fall show, the British have already been heavily involved in training and arming the forces of the Palestinian Authority, the puppet state that exists there now. So the only thing they have in mind is a bigger version of that, one that would be completely controlled by the imperialists. Unfortunately for the British and the Canadians and the French, the US position remains aligned with the maximalist Likud position, which has been voted through the Israeli Knesset this week, which is that the Knesset voted overwhelmingly for the full annexation of the West Bank, meaning that the remaining elements that were still just about in existence from the Oslo period, the sort of the areas of Palestinian puppet state rule within the West Bank, would all be just taken over by the Israeli regime, with devastating consequences for the Palestinian population there. So they voted for this to be official government policy. Now, there are those in the Israeli hierarchy who oppose this and see it as a risky move and one that could lead to greater destabilization, because what this does, if Netanyahu and the Israeli government seriously tries to implement the full annexation of the West Bank, which many of them want to do, that will essentially leave the Palestinian bourgeois, which is a comprador bourgeoisie in many respects, many of them are, who are in business with the Israeli regime. It would leave them with nowhere to run, because the Palestinian bourgeois leadership, personified by that rat Abbas and his friends, their sole remaining claim to legitimacy lies in the fact that they are the ones who can bargain most effectively with Israel. If Netanyahu basically just goes, no more bargaining, we're taking over, then there's no point to the existence of Abbas and co anymore. So what this is also an attempt by the British and others to try and preserve the PLA, the puppet state, the puppet semi-state that's already there. And the way in which this will shake out, I think, is that the Zionists will, of course, or the bulk of the Zionist leadership will continue to say, no, we're not going to make any concessions. We're going to go further. We're going to annex the West Bank, etc. And the clown in Washington, Trump, will continue to agree with them. That's the balance of forces inside the US political system. Interestingly enough, though, that even inside the US, even inside Trump's own party, there is now the beginnings of a rebellion against this. And it'll be very interesting to see if Trump is able to sustain his own maximalist position by September of this year, which is only really a month away. We are now on the 31st of July. So if by the time we get to the meeting of the UN General Assembly and the situation in Gaza remains as it is, do then the British, the French, etc., and the Canadians have the balls to carry out their admittedly lame stunt in the teeth of the defiance of the US imperialists in particular? So even this, like, lame and sort of very weak disagreement between the Europeans and the American regime, it has the potential to fundamentally destabilize things. Because if even the European imperial powers are now voting to establish a Palestinian state, admittedly one that they will totally control, and the US is just saying, no, we just continue the way we are, and backs up like the most aggressive elements in Tel Aviv, then it will further drive home the fact that, like, the Tel Aviv regime is just living on purely according to the will and the whims of US imperialism. That in reality, it is the US itself which keeps Israel alive. It isn't even, I mean, yes, if the British, the French, and others withdrew their support and put sanctions on Israel, yes, that would have an impact, undoubtedly, and we should continue to push for that inside the imperialist countries. Full arms embargo on Israel, trade sanctions on Israel, withdrawal of diplomatic recognition of the Israeli regime. That's another one. All of which is, of course, doesn't deliver what ultimately we want to see, but it does increase the pressure. And if it reaches the point where you now have an open split between on tactics between the Europeans and the United States, this will see a further degeneration of the Israeli regime, because it will be seen for what it is, which is just a puppet of the US, which is what it is, which, as I say, is what it is. So it's an interesting development. It's not a development which is going to lead to a viable solution on its own. But what it shows is the extreme pressure that the Starmer, Macron, etc. Are under, and also the extreme nature of the crisis facing the Israeli regime. See, what this is, in actual fact, is the slightly more subtle imperialists in London and Paris and associated capitals like Berlin, Ottawa, etc. It's their attempt to try and salvage the situation. They think that if they can declare a Palestinian state, get the Israelis to stop doing the most egregious shit that they've been engaging in, calm the situation down, enforce a ceasefire over Gaza, ideally get rid of Netanyahu and stick somebody in there who's a bit more palatable, then they can stabilize things, stop this slide towards oblivion, which the Israeli state is currently engaged in, and then rescue the situation for themselves in West Asia. This is the idea. It's not going to work because, again, if Netanyahu concedes on any of these points, his coalition will fall apart, and the Israeli regime will fall into a terminal crisis. Because even if the Israeli regime held elections, say in late September, October, November time, who would win? There wouldn't be any possibility of forming a government. Remember that before Netanyahu came back, they had like almost 2 years of completely unstable governance in Israel. In the end, the way the Israeli regime is going, what you will end up with is essentially like an unstable dictatorship that ultimately will end up being run by probably like the Israeli military command will end up running it when Netanyahu is too old and too sick to continue, or is got rid of. You'll end up with the Israeli military running things, essentially as a military dictatorship. And ultimately, it will be something that is only guaranteed in its existence by the U.S. administrations, U.S. state itself, U.S. imperial state. Funnily enough, the way things are going at the moment, due to the extremely dysfunctional nature of the U.S. bourgeois political system, ultimately, it will be a fate that is similar that awaits the United States. When U.S. imperialism becomes more and more unstable internally, it's not at the moment, but there is an argument to say that ultimately the U.S. imperialist political system, personified by Trump at the moment, but whoever follows him is unlikely to be any more stable or any better. Just as Biden was a sort of decaying, a literal living morbid symptom of decay, so is Trump. And so then whoever follows after this isn't going to be any better. So eventually, due to the extreme instability of the US regimes, it will be the permanent bureaucracy and the military who end up doing the negotiations with the Russians and the Chinese. It won't end up being the civilian structures who will become too discredited, too unstable, too useless to do anything. You will end up with like the Joint Chiefs of Staff negotiating with the various different governments around the world. And Israel being now a creature of the US is kind of modeling where this is going. And remember, ultimately behind all of this instability, behind all of this inability to actually negotiate on anything, lies the crisis, the deep crisis of US imperialism itself, which is that it needs, as I said, to subjugate and destroy Russia. It needs to do the same thing to Iran. It needs to do the same thing to China. It needs to do all of that within the next few years if it's going to preserve itself. It won't work even if they got all of this. They would still be back in a crisis within 20 years. But they need to do all of these things. The rows and the disputes and the furious back and forth between Trump and the other politicians in the imperial capital aren't about principle. They are about how to pursue this this strategy and what tactics they use to do so. And this is why they can't back down, or they are, they've painted themselves into a corner over Israel. Because if they've adopted, both Trump and Biden have adopted, due to the number of like fanatical supporters of Israel that do exist in their hierarchy, but they've adopted this sort of maximalist position, which leaves no room for any negotiations. And they've also repeatedly violated every agreement that they've even hinted at signing. So they have adopted this position where they back Israel no matter what, which perversely enough is only going to weaken first Israel and then the US itself. The very fact that they require the total domination and submission of all these different areas of the world means that they won't get any of these things. They won't be able to subjugate Russia. They won't be able to subjugate China. They won't be able to subjugate Iran. Because the only way you can actually do that is if you mobilize the US population, if you militarized US society, if you restored domestic industrial production by essentially drastically driving down wages and being able to crush the resistance of the American working class. That way, potentially, you could wage a war on Iran, for instance. Doubt you could even if they did that, they couldn't probably wage a war against China or Russia. But maybe they could do one against Iran and they would lose. They wouldn't win. And it would lead to massive instability inside the United States and maybe ultimately the collapse of the current political system. So the imperialists are stuck. Every way they turn, they can't go forward, they can't go backwards. When you see people like Jeffrey Sachs lamenting that there's no negotiation anymore, there's no negotiation because what they require cannot be negotiated. What they require is total subjugation, and they can't get that. So hence, they are stuck. Right. I see there was a question come in about the online safety bill, which is again like with the latest attempt at like clamp down on free speech, democratic rights, etc. From the Starmer regime here. To be fair, though, to be completely accurate, this would have been done no matter which government came out of the election of last year. It was always going to be more repression, because as we covered yesterday in the episode of Decline and Fall, the British security state and its tame journalists like Carol Cadwallader and Paul Mason, Agent 000, they've all been pushing for increased online censorship for many, many years, at least a decade, because they are stupid enough to think that the reason why everything's slowly disintegrating here is because of people reading bad information on the internet, as they would put it, people reading misinformation, people looking at too many RT articles. And the reason why Brexit was voted for, because of people fucking sharing Facebook memes with their grandfathers in Torquay. It's all nonsense, of course, but it represents like the fear and paranoia of the British security state. And this is just their latest attempt at another clampdown. What I do when it comes to getting around this, I mean, I use currently like Proton VPN. I use Firefox to get on certain sites. For instance, I do a lot of like getting archived news articles from sites I don't want to pay for. So, but that's blocked in Britain now. So I just use Proton VPN. It's not a corporate endorsement, by the way. I am not being paid for this message. And you just put yourself in a European country, and you can get on the archive sites that enable you to get access to archived versions of web pages. If you select Russia, you can get onto like sometimes it's like you can't get on. Well, I can't anyway. If I'm not using a VPN, I can't get onto the Kremlin's official website using like Google Chrome or something like that. So if I want to get onto official Russian government sites, the easier way to do it is to just put yourself in Russia and use like Firefox or use Brave to get around it. It's not actually that hard, to be truth be told, to get around this, because they can't, they might try and ban VPNs. I doubt they will be able to actually carry that off. They might try and do all kinds of things that would limit our ability to look at like sites in Russia or sites in China. But also, they need to look at sites in Russia and China. So they need ways around it themselves. And if you build a way around this attempted, let's call it a Hadrian's Wall of the internet, then there will be other people who will find ways around it as well. Now, what's changed on the internet over the last 20 years, and I'm old enough now to remember the early days of the internet. What's changed is that, yes, it used to be that the regular internet user could find themselves on an RT article. They could find themselves looking at sources of information that the British government or the American government did not approve. And there was a while that level of freedom did exist on the internet. That's all gone now. They have made it basically impossible or very difficult for the average user who doesn't use VPNs, who doesn't know how to navigate around the blocks that are put on internet usage. Just as they managed to not squash, but like severely restrict like file sharing on like music programs, film download programs, and things like the old Pirate Bay and others. Just as they managed to block that off for the average internet user, like that's all still available if you know where to go. But that takes a bit of research and a bit of knowledge as to which VPN to use, which browser to use, how to do it without hitting the blocks, and that takes a little bit of knowledge. Now, DJ Darkside says in a comment there that they're going to try and ban VPNs. They will probably try, but there's always going to be a way around it. Like they've tried banning all kinds of things. They've tried doing all kinds of restrictions, but the fact is you need to build ways around those restrictions for the people who require like full internet access. So like the ruling class themselves require full internet access. Their intelligence services do, their police services do. So if you build a way through your Great Wall, people will find ways around it. Like people in China find ways around like the Chinese government's firewalls. This idea that like nobody in China knows how to get access to like Western websites, etc. That's all nonsense. Plenty of Chinese people can access those. And the Chinese government are much more proficient at blocking stuff than these clowns in London and Washington. So there'll always be ways around it. People will always find ways around it. It's just going to take a little bit more effort. And what they were worried about really was they never expected, I don't think really, no one serious in like the security services ever expected that they will be able to block the Russian, Chinese sources of information off entirely. It's like the free speech question. When it comes to like restrictions on free speech, do they expect to be able to block out everybody's free speech? Do they expect to be able to block out everybody from accessing like WikiLeaks stuff? No, they don't. They don't expect to be able to block everybody off from getting to it. Those who are determined to find a way around these restrictions will find a way around it. And the internet subcultures, the internet subcultures that do exist found ways around it. The idea isn't to knock everybody off. The idea is to stop like these alternative sources of information going mainstream. That's what the idea is. The idea is to push like the stuff that we do, stuff like this stream, stuff like the Decline and Fall show, stuff like the journalism of the Grey Zone. The idea isn't to ban it outright, it's to push it into a corner of the internet, which 90% of internet users will never see. So whereas 10 years ago, you could have seen, as I said, all kinds of articles from different sources getting into people's feeds who weren't like members of subcultures, internet subcultures, that now what the aim is to restore like these division walls between these subcultures, to make sure that the average person continues to only consume news from approved sources. See, the ruling class in Britain is, if not fine, then they can accept like a tiny subculture that reads and understands like media from Russia or China or from America, from alternative American sources or alternative European sources. If that's just a few thousand people, the security services in this country don't really care that much about that. Their worry is when these alternative sources become popularized. That's what their worry is, and that's what that's why they're building their sort of walls of division on the internet to deal with that. So that, like, as Slumbering Colossus says in the chat, that that streams like this one or the Decline and Fall show don't show up in a standard Google search. So if you searched for Zelensky, for instance, that you would never see this show come up on Google. You'd have to maybe it would be there 20 pages into the search, maybe, probably not. And so what they want to do is to push alternative news sources into tiny subcultures that don't affect the majority of the population. That was the concern. That was their worry, because they thought that in like things like Scottish independence referendum, Brexit referendum, the Trump election, and etc., they thought that what that had been caused by was the suddenly the population the wider population suddenly found all the subculture stuff and started engaging with it, and that's why you got those results that you did. And so the idea is to push the broader population back into the narrow news ghetto of only getting stuff from CNN and The Guardian. And this is why they are doing similar things with like the political system, trying to make sure that the great majority of the population only sees certain news and only knows to vote for certain parties, and that you need to discipline and reinforce that mechanism. That's what they're trying to do. Ultimately, it'll fail, because even if you censor absolutely everything, then material reality will catch up with you. Because if people can't afford to put food on the table, then it doesn't matter how much censorship there is. You can't censor that away. People will tend to notice if they can't afford to eat, which is ultimately where we're going. Okay, so interesting little diversion there. I might clip that section and put it into its own video. 411 of you watching at the moment, so thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. We're going to be doing something a little bit different tomorrow on the show. We're going to be looking at a recent interview given by Saint Jeremy of Islington to a twitchy little chap called Owen Jones. So, as I said at the top of the show, we're going to be looking at that tomorrow as like the as our opener. So it's a half an hour interview. So we'll probably be at that for a couple of hours, because there's a series of very important things that come up in that interview, which we should look at. So I will be doing that tomorrow. Hello to Greg, by the way, who came here from the General Pinochet channel. Good to have you with us, Greg. Hope you're enjoying the show. We all draw things to a close here for this evening. Thanks to for 411 of you who have tuned in. Again, we will return to you tomorrow for an analysis of the utterances of Saint Jeremy of Islington as he descends from the mountain to read out the stone tablets to his twitchy follower Owen Jones. So please be sure to join us for that. But for today, Thanks to everybody who's joined us for the stream. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'm going to draw things to a close for this evening, and I'm going to play you out with the what is the intro video, but I forgot to play it on the way in, so here it is on the way out. Thanks, everybody, and we'll be back again with you tomorrow.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.